us now look at Lawrence Stone's famous book, The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, 1500 to 1800. And if you'd like to read more, well, I strongly encourage you to read the whole thing if you're interested in the subject. We will definitely focus later on the chapter devoted to the 18th century. We'll talk some more, probably next week, about the dominant modes of family life that went earlier, but the first part of the book is devoted to methods, definitions, and also the demographic facts. So all these facts and figures borrowed from the demographic approach before Stone goes to discuss other aspects, more personal and sentimental aspects of family life. Generally, this is a very interesting scholar, and he wrote many interesting books, most of which are in the British Studies Centre. So there are separate books on the legal side of marriage and the road to divorce. This is the title of his book about the changing law regarding the divorce in Britain. So if you're interested, go ahead. There's actually a whole small shelf about the family history, and we'll talk about it a little bit more during the live meet. But let us now look at those introductory chapters and see what he writes there. So the first thing that Stone discusses in his book is what he believes to be the key features of the modern family. And by the modern family, he believes the kind of family life that solidified after the period that he describes. So he describes a period of change from the 16th to the 18th, to the end of the 18th century, and by that time he believes this is really the modern family that is well established. I wouldn't be so sure. I think that the Victorian family is quite specific, and well, Stone was writing his book in the late 1970s. So I guess a lot happened in the decades after the book was published. So he would probably, it would be very interesting to ask him if he was still alive, and what he thinks about the modern contemporary family. But for him, the key features of the modern family, which he believes were well established by the 18th century, and especially by the end of the 18th century, especially in the upper class and the middle class, so the richer sections, the richer half of the society, would be intensified affective bonding at the expense of kin and neighbors. So feelings. The family is increasingly about feelings. Feelings between spouses, feelings between parents and children, at the expense of kin, meaning distant relatives, more distant relatives, and neighbors, so the local community. Then, the sense of autonomy, the pursuit of personal happiness. This is something that really starts in the 18th century, the belief that everyone is a unique individual and that everyone is worthy of being happy. So happiness, the pursuit of happiness becomes the main aim of human life in the 18th century. If you're wondering what was before and why nobody wanted to be happy, we'll talk about it next week. But the sense of personal autonomy and the pursuit of personal happiness are very important for the modern worldview generally and the modern family life as well. So, number 3. weakening of association of sexual pleasure with sin and guilt. So this is something that also starts in the 18th century. It takes a little throwback in the 19th century, in the Victorian period, which is, for all we know, quite repressed sexually. But then later in the 20th century and the 21st, we have again this weakening of association of sexual pleasure with sin and guilt. So people are more liberated in their pursuit of sexual pleasure as perhaps part of their pursuit of personal happiness. So the satisfied sexual relations, the satisfying sexual relations are seen as part of a happy life. And the last one, growing desire for physical privacy. I mean the private space. The private space in the home, the private objects, like nowadays everyone has their own computer and their own phone. I remember the times when there was one computer per household and one phone per household. So it did change even within my living memory, which is not that short but not that long. It is something that, according to Stone, also develops in the 18th century and only grows for their physical privacy. People want their own room, people want their own space, people want to have more personal, intimate objects. So then he goes on to discuss different meanings of the word family and related categories. From the 16th century or even earlier onwards. So words like, for example, household, which means all persons living under one roof, which could include servants, as I mentioned before. The term of house, like the House of Usher from literature. The house means the lineage of blood or marriage, dead or alive. The difference between house and kin. Kin are people in this lineage, but only those who are alive. The house is like your whole genealogical tree, the lineage of blood or marriage, dead and alive, the entire tree back to the early ancestors. These are these terms that were historically used as synonyms for the word family. So you could have someone in a letter or some written source writing family and meaning household or house or kin. So you have to be quite careful. And here we have another member of my family. This is Watson, another cat assistant. There are two of them, as you could see, and you'll probably meet them some more during this semester, especially Watson. He's less shy and he doesn't know what I'm doing here, so he is quite curious. The next subject that Lawrence Stone discusses is marriage and changing attitudes to marriage. Again, most people think that marriage has been the same forever, and especially the set of actions that you needed to take to be legally married was always the same. Not really. Actually, according to Stone and his research, until the 11th century, marriage was not very important. At least it was not a sacrament. There was a lot of casual polygamy and cohabitation without any legal or church ceremony. Divorce or separation was easy. This was basically a private contract between two families. And only in the 13th century, the Christian Church decides to take control over marriage. So they introduced the principle of monogamous indissoluble marriage. So this is the type of marriage that most people associate, at least within the Christian culture, that it only involves two people, so monogamy, in contrast to polygamy, or where you have one husband and more wives, or in some rare cases a version of polygamy called polyandry, in which you have one wife and many husbands. But monogamy means one husband and one wife. Indissoluble means divorce is out of the question. It's not known. There are some rare cases in which you could get the annulment, but divorce after a legally binding marriage was not practiced for a long time. It changes in the 19th century. The church takes control in the 13th century. They define and prohibit incest. Incest meaning sexual relations between family members. So it could be blood relations, of course, like sexual relations between, let's say, parents and children, or siblings. It could be also understood more broadly, for example, under some conditions, having a sexual relation with a sister of your former, for example, dead spouse, dead wife, was treated as incest. So if a man married a woman, they were legally married, she lived for some time and then died, and he wanted to marry her sister. There was no blood relation whatsoever, as you can see. It was still considered to be incestuous because of the previous marriage. They became brother-in-law and sister-in-law. It was enough for the church to prohibit that. Another term was fornication and adultery. These two terms both refer to illegal, prohibited sexual relations. Adultery means extramarital relation in which at least one party is married to somebody else. Fornication means extramarital, premarital sometimes, sexual relation with two parties who are not married to somebody else. So if there is a breach of earlier marital vow, we talk about adultery. If there isn't, but still there is this prohibited sexual contact, we talk about fornication. Most of the reasons why it happens is money, unfortunately. This is to exclude illegitimate children, who are called bastards then, from inheritance. So this is the 13th century, and by the 16th century we have different ways and different small ceremonies or legal acts that had to be fulfilled to get a legally binding marriage. So there are 5 different things that could happen. Sometimes all of them were required. Sometimes in history just a couple of them, the most important ones, were necessary. So they could include things like this. 1. Written legal contract between parents. Still, we are in the situation that marriage is a form of legal contract between the families. So it's the parents who sign the contract. Especially if money was involved, if large inheritance was expected at some later stage. This would be something very important. Not so much for the poorer people who didn't have a large fortune to be inherited, and they didn't want to spend a lot of money on legal advice. Then we have the exchange of formal oral promises. So the spousals, it means the exchange of oral promises. So the vows, basically, when the people getting married exchange their mutual promises. Another thing which was quite important was the public proclamation of bans in church. Bans, B-A-N-N-S, means the public announcement, usually after church service, that this and this person is going to marry this and this person. Before the ceremony took place, to ensure that nobody stepped up and said, this person is already married to someone else. So to limit the danger of bigamy, which of course would make the whole marriage invalid in the first place. The fourth thing was the proper wedding ceremony in church, with a blessing by the priest, with the whole religious part of the wedding. This is something that would appear after the legal contract between parents, after the formal oral promises, like the public engagement, the formal engagement, the proclamation of bans. Only then we have the church wedding, and it's even then not yet a fully binding marriage, because what was necessary is the fifth thing, that is the sexual consummation. If there was no sex, you could plead that the marriage was never consummated, so the case in Latin you could say non consummatum, and plead for the annulment of marriage before the ecclesiastical court, and they would state that the marriage never happened. Yes, we have two cats here. I'm not sure they are going to come here. They don't like each other so much. So the church wedding becomes a sacrament in 1439. Before it was not a sacrament. It was a private ceremony. It was an important ceremony for the families, but not a sacrament of the church. It only happens 1439. The presence of a priest is made compulsory for a valid marriage in 1563. And by 1604, all the weddings to be legally binding had to be performed at the church of the place of residence of at least one of the spouses. After 3 bans, the spouses have to be legally mature, so they have to be over 21 years of age. If one or both are under 21, that formal consent of parents or legal guardians is necessary. And all wedding ceremonies had to be performed before noontime. So in practice, this is in the morning, 8 to 12 a.m. The reason? This is before the pubs opened. So it was more likely that the bride and groom, and especially the groom, would be sober. This is the situation before the 18th century. This is something that we'll deal with. In the 18th century, an important legal act is passed. In 1753, it's called Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act, and this links the church law with the civil law. So only the church wedding is legally binding, and there are some rules concerning that. We'll return to this later on when we talk about the 18th century. What about divorce then? In the late 17th century, divorce is first introduced by private act of parliament. This is also something that we will return to quite a few times. Just remember, in the 18th century, divorce is available for the first time, and you need to pass it through the entire parliamentary process. So you can imagine what happened. So let's say from 1660 1770, when it was passed, to 1750, there were only 17 cases of divorce proceeded in Parliament. It doesn't mean that all people stayed together for life. There was a lot of abandonment. The bigamy still happened and was possible. There were also some strange folk customs, like the custom of wife sale. We'll talk about it later on because it still happens in the 18th century. What can be deduced from the demographic facts? I'm also following from Stone's book, so if you want more details, if you want to check the dates again, see the first 2 chapters of Stone's book. So, marriage. What was the meaning of marriage? Why people got married? Usually followed some sort of family strategy, which included the continuity of the family name, so the male line, the preservation of the property or the acquisition of property. So it's all about status and money and lands. This is politics. At a national level, if the marriages in royal family are concerned, or at a very private, small-scale level in individual families. The idea was to have the largest possible number of children and marry them into wealthy families. This would prove that your line would continue, especially regarding very high numbers for child mortality. Also, you would get help in your old age from this large family, and you would acquire property or important alliances through marriage of your sons and daughters. If you had some extra children you couldn't really marry off to your own advantage, there were other options. Before the Reformation of Henry VIII, you could always send your younger daughters to a nunnery, so they could become nuns and pray for you. And you could always send your spare sons that you don't need anymore to be either members of the clergy or the military. This was something that was done a lot, and this was not really the decision of the children themselves. This was not a career choice for the children. This was the political choice for the families. Of course, when the nunneries are abolished by the Reformation of Henry VIII in the 16th century, most of girls, like 95% of girls, eventually married. Probably not the ones they chose, because the idea of choosing a spouse was not yet known, especially if you were a girl, but like 95% of girls eventually married. Bachelors were much more tolerated. So in the 17th and 18th century, something like up to 1/4 of the sons remained unmarried. This is a visible trend. So some of them didn't want to get married because, for example, they were homosexual and they didn't want to be bothered with marrying a woman, or they wanted to enjoy sexual relations without the bother of getting married, and it was more tolerated in the society than having spinsters, that is, unmarried women. What else can we get? The age of marriage, for example. The people who married early were the eldest sons, the heirs to the family name. They could get married in the early 20s. But all the rest, including women, they married significantly later. The age of first marriage rises, really. For the upper class, it rises slowly, but it rises. And let's say from 21 on average in the 16th century, have 26 in the 17th century, and even later on. For women, again, 20 in the late 16th century, 23 in the 17th, and later above 25. So why do young people get married older as the time progresses? There are some reasons for it. First of all, Stone observes there is more freedom of choice in the partner, so it usually takes more time. There is a growing emphasis on higher education, so the sons spend more time at school and university, and very often, if the financial means of the family allowed it, they go on grand tour after that. So they have like this extensive, sometimes lasting for a few years even, cultural trip of Europe. So something that is becoming really expected of the sons of the richer families. So increasingly also among all social groups, it is expected that when young people marry, they need to have sufficient capital to start a new household. So they need to have either steady income, steady job, or accumulated capital to start a new household. That is why poorer people marry surprisingly late. So for both sexes, it would be between 27 and 28 for men and 25 to 27 for women. So long apprenticeship and the time to save the money. So what we have is really the kind of information that is taken from the statistical demographic data and then used for interpretation. So next week we'll continue with that, and we'll talk about the dominant forms of family life before the 18th century, so before the period that we are going to focus on more. Thank you, and see you next week.